Well, hello, everybody out there in internet land. My name is Dr. Ben Vallo. I'm the laboratory director here at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And I'm really excited to bring you this afternoon's weekly webinar, Indigenous Knowledge, Shifting Narrative, Enhancing Documentation, and Changing Policy in Museum Collections with Brian Vallo. But before we get started with the presentation for today, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the webinar series and some tips for enhancing your viewing experience. Here at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, we acknowledge the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, or Navajo, and the Hickory Apache, people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and the future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Now, Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. Our mission here at Crow Canyon is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And you can check out our website at crowcanyon.org to find out about all the different types of research, education, and American Indian initiatives that we're involved in right now. Now, unfortunately, our campus is still closed to visitation without other than by appointment, but you can check out our website and see all the things we're doing. And we're located in southwestern Colorado, just outside of Cortez, Colorado. And as you can see in the background of this slide, our campus is right in front of the Ute Mountain, that's the beautiful Ute Mountain, right here in the very southwest corner of southwest Colorado. And so we want to thank you all for supporting and contributing to our webinar series. So before we get started, I want to give you a couple of tips to enhance your viewing experience. So I know over the last several years, many of us around the world have become quite familiar with the video conferencing program Zoom. But just in case you aren't familiar, I want to give you a couple of tips that'll make your experience that much better. So the first tip is that you can move the talking heads. So when I load Zoom, usually up in the upper right, I see a column of boxes with people's heads, myself at the top right now talking, and you can actually rearrange and reconfigure those boxes as you see fit to help you in case they're covering up some part of Brian's great presentation. So you can drag those around, you can change the configuration with your cursor. The next thing is that we're going to be taking questions to ask Brian, and he's asked to get those questions at the end of his talk. And somewhere on your screen, you should be able to see there's a little box, a black box that says chat, raise hand, Q&A, or live transcript. And so you can go ahead and click on the Q&A button, and then you can actually type your questions in. And Taylor Hasbrook, our webinar guru, and I will be trying to compile light questions throughout Brian's talk. So at the end, we can kind of put different things together and post him some great questions. If you want to chat, so say hello to any of us or to Brian or whatever, you can put those in the chat and just try to keep those separate from the Q&A. It'd be really helpful. If you're having difficulties viewing the presentation, you can also head over to our live stream of the talk at crowcanyon.org/Facebook on our Facebook page. And that has like a 1 or 2 second delay. And so it's pretty much to the second live, but you can also ask questions in there, and we'll try to incorporate those into the questions as we go along. We also invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can actually see many or most of the previous presentations that happen every week. And that's crowcanyon.org/YouTube. And we invite you to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because that allows us to unlock additional features that will increase your viewing experience. So check that out too. To foreshadow the presentations we have coming up in our weekly webinar series, we have next week we have a presentation by Dr. Bruce Bradley, one of our long-term collaborators and one of the original Crow Canyon archaeologists. And he'll be giving a presentation called 13th Century Reuse of Wallace Great House, which will be brought to you in part by the Satsanom chapter of our local Archaeological Society here in Cortez. And that's Thursday, September 15th at 4 p.m. Then the following week, we have presentation that's part of the Four Corners lecture series, and that's entitled The Geology of Canyons of the Ancients National Monument with Laura Hartman, and that's Thursday, September 22nd at 4 p.m. So now I'm going to turn to this afternoon's presentation. Like I said, we're going to be hearing from Brian Vallo, the presentation called Indigenous Knowledge, Shifting Narrative, Enhancing Documentation, and Changing Policy in Museum Collections. And I'll tell you a little bit about Brian, if I can get my webs, there we go. So Brian Vallo is a member of the Pueblo of Acoma tribe in New Mexico, and with 30 years experience working in areas of museum development, cultural resource management, historic preservation, the arts, and tourism, Brian has dedicated his career to promoting Native American arts and culture, as well as advocating for the protection of sacred sites and repatriation of ancestors and items of cultural patrimony held in museums and private, federal, and state institutions. He recently completed a 3-year term as governor of his tribe, and he's a self-taught painter. Brian is inspired by his culture and the landscape of Acoma, which influenced his multimedia paintings. So without further ado, I want to welcome Brian Vallo thank you very much for coming and speaking with us. And I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share here. I think I just did. And go ahead, and if you'd like to share your screen, you can take it away.
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Vallo. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here to be part of this webinar series, and I've had the opportunity to work with Crow Canyon on a number of projects over the years, and have just great admiration for all the important work and the collaboration and partnerships that are so meaningful and really important to advancing our collective work. So, thank you so much to everyone for including me in this series. I just want to start off by saying that, when I give presentations of this type, I always want to make sure that folks understand that I am not a trained archaeologist. My involvement over the years on issues around the protection of sacred sites and cultural resources, cultural landscapes, and being an active participant in consultations with numerous institutions and organizations and agencies is really a result of my involvement in my own tribe as a tribal government official, but also as a cultural leader, and also a very traditional upbringing, where I was at a very early age exposed to a lot of traditional knowledge. And I'm grateful that I can participate in work related to the study and the practice of archaeology, but I also have developed some concerns along with other Native colleagues who have been working in this field for quite some time. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that we have a growing number of Native American and Pueblo people who are pursuing formal training and completing degrees in archaeology and anthropology, as well as other fields that are important to to the work that we are all engaged. So again, thank you for this great opportunity this afternoon. So today I'm going to speak a little to the work that I've been engaged more recently. And, you know, really an initiative that has been ongoing for quite some time in the field of museology. While I was the director of the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research here in Santa Fe, where I reside, this really provided an opportunity for me to advance some of the work that had been started by my predecessor, Cynthia Chavez Lamar, who is now the director of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. And it was, you know, through that work at SAR, the school, or the Indian Arts Research Center, that really opened some doors and provided me an opportunity to bring forth some of the work that we were engaged at SAR to other institutions, as well as organizations and agencies throughout the country. And I'm really grateful that that experience really has provided opportunities for our own Native people to have a seat at the table, to be part of discussions, and have some influence in some decision making around the collections of our from our respective tribes, everything from ancestors to you know, contemporary art. So I really credit the School for Advanced Research for their willingness to provide the directors of the Indian Arts Research Center and everyone who is involved and engaged with SAR to really help set the tone for this. I like to refer to it as a movement that is evolving and really making some, forcing us to think differently about the way in which we do this work within the field of museology, but also how this work then happens at home within our tribal communities. So I am attempting to advance my. As I just stated, you know, my roots are in Acoma. Raised in Acoma, lived with my paternal grandparents at the old village at Acoma, which you see here. And this is just such an incredible place. Those of you who have been to Acoma will know that, you know, the setting is just unlike anywhere else in the world. And the history of our people and the history that predates Acoma, that goes back to our ancestral homelands in the Four Corners region of the states, is just an incredible account of Pueblo people and culture. And so I really credit the place, the sacred space, for providing all that it does for our people. I have had the privilege of serving as a tribal leader for my community. These are appointed positions. We're appointed by the hierarchy of our clan system. And just recently, I completed a 3-year term as the governor of my tribe. And so it's very true that our place name Agu, or Hagu, which means to prepare, or in this case, a place prepared, really, you know, it just resonates with me, and I think with a lot of people, that this place is special. It has and contains all the spiritual power that we need, especially in this time, as we are experiencing some of the prophecies that of our ancestors in this time, and I have a strong belief that Og will continue to provide for us so that we might sustain our life way into the future. And we are all very anxious to re-engage with our cultural practices, because during this time of pandemic, we have not had that opportunity. So, I wanted to share these slides at the very onset so that you understand my connection and the importance of this special place to me, and the significant role that the cultural values and community and family have on my work, whether it be working with museums or knocking on the doors of Congress, the halls of Congress, to address policy issues, and then doing things at home, being proactive in language revitalization initiatives, preservation of our culture, of our architectural history, and advancing really the Pueblo overall, so that we might, provide and prepare for our future. So I also want to, I'm not going to take too much time here, but I want to say that, our history, our recent history, is so fraught with many challenges, challenges that have been a result of contact, European contact, but everything that followed that initial contact. And unfortunately, the efforts of our own government, the United States government, on the effort to remove, efforts to steal, and really transform our being on our ancestral lands through policy. And many of you are probably familiar with a lot of these policies that really challenged our sovereignty, our ability to maintain culture and our own indigenous religious practices. But all of the other, federal laws that govern everything from education and healthcare, our justice systems, really do not provide safeguards for our people, our Native people. And while there have been efforts over the years to provide some opportunity for Native people, it is always a fight. We are in a constant fight for a place at the table. We are constantly in a fight to protect our sovereignty, to gain access to decision makers, to be invited to participate in meaningful consultation and discussions around the issues that are of concern to Native people. In the early 1990s, there were two significant pieces of federal policy that were passed by the Congress. One, which established the National Museum of the American Indian, and also the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. These two federal policies were very critical to, one, advancing some of the discussion around, access and really wanting to know what institutions throughout the country had in terms of collections of ancestral human remains, their associated funerary materials, and sacred items. But also then to understand how we might be able to repatriate or return these items back to our respective tribal communities. The establishment of the National Museum of the American Indian was also a significant action of the Congress, creating a museum, one that would represent all tribal nations in this country and indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. And how this institution, part of a larger network of museums, the Smithsonian, would serve as a resource to Native people, Native communities, in addressing other issues outside of perhaps repatriation, but thinking about representation, reassessing collections that are in the hands of the Smithsonian and the National Museum, to better understand what they have, to more carefully document what they have, because it was very clear in the very initial years of the implementation of NAGPRA that the inventories, even those from the National Museum of the American Indian or the Smithsonian, were very rough, or did not provide adequate information. A lot of items unidentified, many items misidentified or categorized, which caused a tremendous amount of confusion as tribes were receiving these inventories and trying to figure out their strategies for repatriation of those items covered under NAGPRA. So these two pieces of legislation, I think really opened the door, while they also were and are flawed, especially NAGPRA. And we learned just through practice of an implementation of NAGPRA that there are many aspects of this process for repatriation that are that do not flow, that do not necessarily create a process that is fair and equitable to tribes. Rather, it presents a tremendous amount of challenges for tribes. It's a very costly process, but it's also one that is time-consuming and really challenges and tests our own internal cultural understandings and ethics and practices in dealing with and discussing ancestors and ancestral human remains, or human remains in general, and these sacred items that are considered cultural patrimony, never authorized to have left our communities, and never to have been exposed to the public outside of our own respective tribes. So there is, while these pieces of legislation did create process, they created some opportunity, they remain a bit of a challenge. And I think that with the recent review of NAGPRA, the law itself, something that is still ongoing even today, we are hopeful that the outcome of this review will provide a much more fair process, a streamlined process for repatriation, and also increase the penalties for those who violate the law. This is one of the things that was of great concern to tribal leaders, and it came through loud and clear during the consultations that were organized by the federal agencies last year. So I'm hopeful that the revisions will reflect and will have addressed many of the concerns that were voiced by tribal leaders during a very involved consultation process. So, you know, I reference some of this as a problem, and it's, you know, really, again, rooted in Western science and Western thought around, you know, the practice from archaeology and you know, many of those government funded or government supported, government mandated excavations of many of our ancestral Pueblo homelands here in the Southwest and in other parts of the country. And the removal of ancestors and their funerary items, as well as other items from these abandoned places. Many of these collections ending up in institutions throughout the country. Many of these items also left in the hands of the archaeologists themselves, the anthropologists themselves, and others who were directly involved in some of these excavations. Hundreds of thousands of items, if not more, spread out throughout the country and abroad. And so when the NAGPRA inventories started to arrive on our doorsteps at our respective tribes, it was just so overwhelming to know that, for example, for Acoma, that there were literally thousands, tens of thousands of items on these inventories identified as Acoma. Ancestors from Acoma, ancestors from our ancestral Pueblo lands, including the Mesa Verde region, Chaco Canyon, the Mimbres region, places that are significant to Acoma's culture. And trying to make sense of why and how these, you know, so many items were removed. And then discovering that the inventories were not really providing a whole lot of information, and that the Western science and the practice was dictating the identification of material culture as well as sacred materials. And that we didn't have, our tribal communities didn't have any input in this process. And that we had absolutely no control over the study of these materials, whether it was invasive or, you know, research that was based in review of documentation, reports, field reports and such. But that this all of a sudden was accessible to the public, accessible to the academy. And it wasn't until, you know, the passage of NAGPRA that a process to be informed of what these institutions did have became available. And many of these items also became part of exhibitions, presented in a narrative that is not ours, but a narrative that is based on the study and the Western science. Many assumptions made about our cultures, the reasons why our ancestors left these places, why there are these magnificent archaeological remnants, why places were designed the way they were, placed where they are, and many assumptions about use of materials extracted and excavated from these sites. So this narrative is one that is not ours, but one that we have been very concerned about and one that we want to change. The other issue is around the larger collections, those that are not protected necessarily by NAGPRA, but that will remain in these institutions long term. And our concern being, how can we have a seat at that table to discuss long-term stewardship and access and an institution's mission or philosophy around research? These are the big questions that comprise this problem that I reference. And it's really, a collective effort among many tribes throughout the country who have been voicing these concerns, and some who are engaged even now in this movement that is creating a change that is forcing all of us to be thinking differently about collection stewardship, access, and representation of these materials in these institutions. So I referenced the School for Advanced Research earlier, and how grateful I am to them for allowing us to, really delve into the issues that have been voiced by many Native scholars, tribal leaders, cultural leaders throughout the country. We developed a series of guidelines. They're called the Guidelines for Collaboration, and it's really some really simple guidelines that have been created for both museums and tribal communities to consider when they are looking at ways to partner and collaborate. But also, they have been helpful in refining processes around consultation, not only for NAGPRA related issues, but consultation in general on many issues, issues regarding healthcare, education, and all of the other areas of concern for our tribes. These guidelines really have become the basis for some of these institutions who have joined the movement, who have made a commitment to engage Native people themselves, descendant community members themselves, in reassessing or assessing their operations and evaluating existing exhibitions, existing collections management policies, and being involved in discussions around conservation of these materials. Again, thinking about that long-term stewardship. So one of the things that is currently happening as a result of these guidelines is that the American Alliance of Museums, which is the nation's largest association of museums, is considering and working with SAR in the development of advancing the guidelines and really bringing forth this proposal to accept the guidelines as the standard principles or guidelines for doing this work. So I'm really excited about this, because I think if that happens, if it plays out the way that I hope it does, then institutions would be not necessarily mandated, but they would be required to consider these guidelines in their approaches to establishing partnerships and collaborations with tribes. There is also an association called the Association for Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. This organization does incredible work and really is a convener of Native American and non-Native museum practitioners, as well as Native American artists, scholars, tribal leaders, cultural leaders who come together in a conference setting, but who are also meeting regularly throughout the year to address issues that are of importance to them. And the ATOM has really been instrumental in supporting the SAR in the distribution of the guidelines, and really encouraging institutions that they are partners with to utilize these guidelines in the work that they do. So during my directorship at the Indian Arts Research Center, I was asked to join the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City on the development of an exhibition of a private collection, the Diker collection. And unfortunately, we were brought in at a time when the guest curator and the curator of the American Wing at the Met and others within the institution had already laid the groundwork for this exhibition. So when I joined, along with 6 other Native advisors, we came to this project at a time that, where a lot of the decisions had already been made. And, even while that was the case, we made for sure that we, voiced our concerns regarding the scope of the exhibition. We had many concerns around the items that had been pre-selected for the exhibition. And we felt that there was a need to have some level of consultation with specific tribal groups, because there were some items in the collection and that were scheduled to be on display that we were very concerned about, because they would fall in the categories of sacred items, perhaps items of cultural patrimony. And so it was I think a learning experience for all of us, because again, this was probably one of the first times that I and some of the other advisors had been directly involved and engaged in a process like this. I think it was exciting that one of this country's flagship institutions like the Met was actually interested in doing this. But it was challenging, and I think in the end, as hard as we tried, the Native American advisors felt comfortable with the end product, and we knew that this was going to include the opportunity for rotating items, which was really important, because we wanted to make for sure again that there was representation of many of our tribes in the country, and their material culture that would be featured in the exhibition, while also providing an opportunity for the introduction of contemporary Native art in the exhibition and also in other areas of the museum. So I'm very pleased that while this was somewhat controversial, and somewhat of a challenge. I am really pleased at the way in which things turned out. I am very grateful to the Met for really listening to the advisors and creating a structure at the Met to include the hiring of a curator of the Native American art section of the American Wing, who is now on board and who has been really very active and proactive in moving forward with an agenda that is, that considers some of those, some of the guidance that we provided as advisors, but also bringing together additional Native American representatives, including artists and scholars and other museum professionals, to really create a program at the Met that will be ongoing and that will celebrate not only the historic items that are in their collection, but also celebrate and feature the contemporary art that is evolving in Indian country. One of the things that, or the outcomes of all of this was in 2018, I had the privilege of meeting with the metropolitan leadership to ask if we might think about developing an exhibition of the School for Advanced Research, Indian Arts Research Center Historic Pueblo Pottery Collection. And we had been given the authorization and the support of the Met to do just that. And so in 2018, I made the big announcement that we would be curating a show of that would feature the SAR collection at the Metropolitan sometime in 2021. Now, with the onset of the pandemic, that changed things, and unfortunately, I was no longer at SAR and back in my Pueblo serving as governor. But I'm really grateful that SAR and the Indian Arts Research Center moved forward and working with the Met, as well as another private foundation, the Vilcek Foundation, who advanced this initiative. And so the exhibit, now called Grounded in Clay, which just opened in Santa Fe in July, will be traveling to the Met next summer. So I'm really excited about this. And, this is just one of the example of how the Met commitment of the Met is playing out. And they're being very open to consider these collaborations with our tribal communities, because Grounded in Clay is really an exhibit curated by Pueblo people themselves. The Pueblo Pottery Collective evolved as a result of this project. They curated this exhibit and determined that this exhibit would travel even after it is featured at the Met next summer. It's scheduled to travel to other places throughout the country, and hopefully to some of our tribal museums here in the States. So while this was happening, I had also been contacted by the Field Museum in Chicago, who had announced that they would be rehabilitating the Native American Hall. And in one of my first slides, you saw the photo of the Anglo group of people walking through, the black and white photo of Anglo people walking through an exhibit display of these mannequins fully dressed in Native American attire. And that was the original exhibition that was on exhibit at the Field Museum for almost 70 years. And so the Field Museum and the curator, Alika Wali, had a vision for how this rehabilitation might happen. They considered the guidelines for collaboration that were published by SAR and invited me to joined them in organizing an advisory committee. They did, of course, all of the work. Many of us came together and provided names of individuals throughout the country, many of whom were Native American museum professionals, but also cultural experts and scholars, Native American scholars. And in the end, you see in the photo there at the bottom left is a group of the Native American Advisory Committee, all of whom made a 5-year commitment to the Field Museum to work together to develop this exhibition, but also to work with the Field Museum during the deinstallation of this exhibit that had been up for nearly 70 years. There were many problems and many challenges that we rose during even the initial term of this work. And there was a lot of pushback by the institution. And those of us who were advisors, had the opportunity to meet with the leadership of the Field Museum to not only convey our concerns and to offer our gratitude for them even willing to embark on this effort, but to convey to them that there are some very significant issues. There is a history here that is not necessarily positive, because the field has a reputation, let's just say, that they have not actively engaged in repatriation, that they continue to house a large collection of Native American ancestral remains and associated funerary materials, and many sacred items. So there, I'm sorry, we had to have many conversations in the very first year of this effort. And we had a lot of unusual asks of the institution. It raised eyebrows. Our concerns, in some cases, were maybe dismissed. Other times, the institution just didn't know how to react. But as we continued the conversations, we found ways to have the conversation. We found ways to address our concerns. And in some cases, there were some very unusual processes that emerged during, especially deinstallation of the exhibit, because of the needs of our tribal communities, the voiced needs of our tribal communities, to really provide an opportunity for these items that have been on display for so long to be treated with the utmost respect and to be provided an opportunity to rest. In that photo in the middle there is an Acoma manta and a box next to it that contains a pottery that were both on exhibit. And one of the unusual requests made by yours truly was that we at Acoma wanted to bring a couple of the items, if not all of them, that were on display outdoors. That we wanted them to have some fresh air. Now, the conservators and the collections team looked at me like I was a crazy person, and I think in their eyes and just the reaction, the answer was no. But it took me explaining to them the need for these items, which have a spirit of their own, to have the opportunity to see sunlight, to be exposed to air, and be refreshed with water. And I'm grateful that after having had the opportunity to provide some explanation, as well as details about what I would actually be doing with the items once they were outdoors, that they came around and supported the idea. And so that afternoon, very late afternoon, when we finally took the two pieces outside onto the west patio of the Field Museum, it was very emotional for me, but I could just sense the anticipation and anxiety of the items, even while we were deinstalling and making preparations to take them outside. And I had my privacy. They provided that for me, and the two staff who assisted me stood back and offered me time. And it was so beautiful that just as I unpacked the pottery and took it out of the box, that it started to rain. So that was a clear indication that they were nourished not by me, but by the spirits. And I felt like they had just been rejuvenated and were prepared to rest, even if it meant they would rest here in this institution. Months later and years later, the exhibit evolved, not only with the advisors who comprised the committee, but with literally over 100 other Native people, artists and scholars and community leaders, cultural leaders, who brought together to assist in the development of this exhibit, which is called Native Truths, Our Voices, Our Stories. This exhibit represents a total transformation of the Native American Hall. It's very much a new space, a contemporary space. It presents significant historic items from tribes throughout North America, while also featuring many contemporary Native art pieces, installation pieces, murals and video and fashion, the written word. So the Native voice and the Native stories come through loud and clear in this rendition. And I'm very excited that, the exhibit was also, will also accommodate the rotation of both historic and contemporary art pieces in the permanent sections of this new space, but that it also provides an opportunity through the rotating pods that exist within this gallery to feature more in-depth stories of Native America into the future, because these pods will eventually change. They will tell new stories. They will bring in new people, new storytellers. They will bring in the creative spirit of our Native people through the art, through voice and song. So it's really exciting, and I'm so grateful that we had this opportunity to present Native America from the Native voice. And some of us will maintain our role as advisors for 2 more years as we begin discussing the first rotation of the items in some of the pods. And we will also be addressing some of the other issues that are pending, one of which is repatriation. Many issues around conservation, especially where the items that were removed from the 70-year-old exhibit are concerned. And also, having an engagement with the educators, the folks within the museum who are helping to tell the story, the docents, the others within the education and marketing teams at the museum, so that they are continuously promoting the exhibit, but also creating interpretive and educational programming for visitors, but also for schools. So, this will be ongoing. One of the other important parts of all of this is that we want to create ways for our own people to come to Chicago to see the exhibit. We want to provide some form of access, whether it be virtually or in person. We want to make for sure that our own people have the opportunity to engage with this exhibit. So this experience at the Field Museum really sets a new bar, and one that I hope will be utilized by other institutions in the country. Many of them are already looking to the Field Museum for guidance on creating a similar structure as they think about new exhibitions, rehabilitation of permanent exhibitions, as they're thinking about stewardship of collections. So, it's exciting, but, this is really, I think, a time in this work that we've been engaged for many, many years, some of us, where we are seeing some really positive change. And it's influencing the practice, but also the policy of institutions. That leadership at the highest levels of these flagship institutions are considering changes in their policies to accommodate the needs of Native America. And I just hope that this will continue, and that more of our own Native people, some of whom have been hired by the Field Museum, will continue to have a presence and a place in these flagship institutions, because there is so much more work to be done. And I'm hopeful that the Field will continue to maintain its commitment, and I believe that they will, moving forward with this initiative. The other project that I wanted to highlight quickly here is the Fine Arts Museums, or the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. There are a group of 5 Pueblo advisors, including myself, who have been part of this project. And it's really stems from a gift of a private collector who came forth with a significant collection of ancestral Pueblo ceramics, as well as historic Pueblo materials. It's a beautiful collection of our material culture, but also a collection that is of great concern because of the fact that many of these items are likely removed during excavation. Many are associated with burials, and there are some that are sacred items that would qualify for repatriation under NAGPRA. And while there may not be an exhibition of this collection, of the full collection, we have come together to work directly with the collector himself, but also folks at this institution, to develop a strategy for how best to, one, and most importantly, steward this collection, especially of those materials that are of concern, but also helping them to develop a process for access to this collection and the presentation of some items from this collection in their museum or at their museum. One of the main deliverables as that was part of the gift to this institution was to create and publish a catalog. And of course, those of us who were the advisors were very concerned about the presentation of items that are sensitive, culturally sensitive. I am so excited about the catalog at this point, because one of the things that evolved as a result of these very difficult conversations, and a lot of this, just like the Field Museum project, took place during COVID, when we didn't have an opportunity to come together and talk face to face, but we were utilizing a virtual format just like we are today to have these difficult conversations and to convey our concerns, but to hear from one another ideas of how we might arrive at some mutually, I guess, agreed upon solutions. So the publication is pretty much done at this point. It includes, I believe, over 60 entries by Pueblo people themselves and other Native people from throughout the country, essays from Native scholars, and also the involvement of Native artists. Because one of the things that resulted from the assessment of the culturally sensitive materials is that we felt it was important to document the collection and to present the collection in this publication, though from a different lens, that we wouldn't actually authorize the photography of, for example, a Membri's bowl. And on this slide, you see at the right, on the right-hand side, there is a digital reproduction of a Membri's bowl that is part of this collection. And this was the solution. This was what we all agreed was appropriate to do. That this item, which is potentially associated with a burial, could be presented in this form, to still share with the public that a maker of the Membri's culture created this bowl with this design, and that the interpretation of the design is also provided to the viewer or user of the catalog. And so we engaged Native American artists to help us in recreating these items. Now, there are also some very sensitive materials that will not be shown in this catalog, but we arrived at an agreement to leave those spaces blank. So in this catalog, you will see full color photos of some of these incredible pieces. You will see some drawings. You will see some digitally created drawings, and you will see some blank spaces with brief descriptions of what that image is. This has been a very involved process. It involved many difficult conversations and a lot of educating of not only the museum personnel, but also the collector. And I will also say that the advisors learned a tremendous amount from this process. And it really has informed, I think, the work that will occur moving forward as we continue to deal with other situations where there are items similar to these here that have been maybe left in limbo for many years because we've not actually had the opportunity to have the discussions as we have during this project. So I'm very excited that this process will inform future work, and that this process really is representative of what's happening in this movement. This collection is Southwest based. And I want to emphasize that there are similar projects that involve other tribes from throughout the country where we see this level of collaboration occurring. And this is the important piece. If we can maintain this momentum, if we can influence decision-making and really co-author policy and create a process for accountability, then I think we will have achieved and fulfilled our inherent responsibility as Native people to protect our culture, our heritage, our material culture, everything that comprises us as Native people. These projects have and will continue to evolve. Our work is not done, but it really sets the stage for future work. And as a matter of fact, the 5 of us who have been part of this particular project will be engaged in another project concerning a collection of ancestral Pueblo remains, funerary items, and other sensitive materials that have been in limbo for a few decades now. But this process will certainly inform the work that we will engage here in the coming months. So the impact of this work is really extensive, and I just wanted to again say that repatriation and the revision of the NAGPRA policy itself is huge. It's really significant, and I am really looking forward to seeing the revised law and hoping that it really will set the stage for a more proactive repatriation process and relieve some of the strain that this has caused for our tribal communities. Consultation practice is still evolving. We all have to get better at it. Our institutions need to be the experts where consultation is concerned, and we're not there yet. There's still so much to do, but this is one of those areas where these types of projects are really having an impact on really uplifting that process and giving a lot of the ownership to the tribal communities in leading those conversations and ultimately influencing decision-making. Research is also another one where we're seeing, with more Native scholars at the table and Native professionals in the fields of archaeology, anthropology, museum studies, art, history, law. This is really setting a new tone for the types of research, Native-led research, Native-inspired research that is occurring in the academy. We're also building capacity, and this is really important. And I'm so grateful to see so many young Native people entering these fields. Excuse me, it's so critical to advancing this work into the future. And building that capacity at home also. As more tribal museums are being created, historic preservation offices are being created. These Native people who are formally trained will be the ones really to shape the future of this work. And again, to see the informed changes in policy and practice is just so refreshing. We wanted this for a long time, and it's slow moving, and we're just now realizing some of these now. But to see that it can actually happen is just really motivating and empowering. One of the other things, lastly, here is that we're seeing outside of the more formal institutions and agencies and organizations, that private collectors are also thinking about these things. Private collectors have heirs who do not want the responsibility of maintaining their collections. And so there are many who are up in arms about what to do with their collections. But we're finding that more private collectors are reaching out to tribes or reaching out to institutions to find out how they can be in touch or in contact with the appropriate individuals at tribes, and in some cases are voluntarily returning items that get identified as being culturally sensitive. So there's some movement there, but still much work to be done. And that's also one of the pending issues, where the Safeguard Tribal Objects of Patrimony Act or the STOP Act is concerned. We were hoping it would have passed in this Congress, but it's likely to move out into the next Congress. But the STOP Act is designed to really enhance the penalties of NAGPRA and also address the ongoing problem of illegal exportation and sale and exportation of cultural items from the United States. I mentioned the collecting issue and the fate of private collections, but also, there's this issue of appropriation that is ongoing, and the recreation by non-native people of ancestral material culture. We have private collections that even today we're finding modifications are being made to private collections so that they become more sellable and attractive to collectors and dealers. So, this is one of those areas that's I think we have a long road ahead. And of course, the sacred sites protection. As we're talking about protecting our material culture, we then are concerned about the places from where these items originate, where they were taken from, as I discussed in that one of my first slides. How do we restore our sacred places? How do we restore our ancestral homelands? Because they are still, to us, very much alive. They are cultural resources to us in this time, and they will be in the future. And so we want to ensure that while we're doing this work around preservation and protection and the return of items to our contemporary or present day tribes and pueblos, that we want to ensure our ancestral places are protected. So with that, folks, I want to say tawa. Thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about my work and my perspectives and views on things. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I apologize for going over my time, but I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for this incredible presentation. And don't worry about the time, you were perfect with that. So we do have several questions. I know more of them are pouring in. But at a very kind of simple level, we had some folks, expressing their deep thanks for the work you've done, but also asking how can they support these efforts?
Thank you. That's a great question. There are many ways that folks can become involved. I think that Crow Canyon is a good example. You have a very extensive reach and membership, and I think just becoming educated on these issues through organizations like Crow Canyon or your local natural history museum, or reaching out to the National Museum of the American Indian and finding ways that you can support some of the initiatives that benefit all of Indian country, I think is really important. But also, looking to your local tribes, asking them how you can support their work around repatriation. They might have initiatives within their own tribal museums where they, might need some resources or support or technical expertise. Those are some of the ways that come to mind that I would encourage folks to reach out.
That's great. So there was a question about objects of cultural patrimony. Can you maybe explain that a little more to some of our viewers?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Cultural patrimony would be most of the time sacred items that are held by the community and not necessarily by an individual, but that are utilized by the community or cared for by the community. And in some instances, these items of cultural patrimony, which were never to have left our respective tribes, found their way out. And when an item that is classified as cultural patrimony owned by this greater community have left, it's a big concern, because most of the time it means that those items are very significant to the ongoing practice of culture.
Interesting. Great. Yeah, thanks. That's exactly what I think folks needed a clarification on. So are you working with other museums locally? I mean, other than the great examples you gave us?
I am. I do some work with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and also the Denver Art Museum. I have been engaged with the museums here in New Mexico, the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, the Fine Arts Museum, the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque. And, like I said, there are other projects that are emerging at this point. We'll be working with some university museums. I've worked with the University of New Mexico and the Maxwell Museum over the years, the National Museum of the American Indian. So, it just depends on the needs. Like I said, I'm one of many Native people who are engaged in this level of this work that is happening in different parts of the country. And, my expertise is in Southwest materials, of course. So I engage with those institutions who have larger collections of materials from our pueblos.
Great. So kind of along those lines then, are there, for say maybe a smaller museum or even institutions that maybe not even are classified fully as museums that have collections that want to participate in this type of work, who should they contact to be able to kind of start some of these similar processes?
So I would go back to the guidelines for collaboration. That is just a handy source for answering that question. Who are the appropriate people to contact, when you're initially starting out and trying to develop a project or a partnership. And it ranges, not every tribe is set up the same way. So, in some cases, you might be dealing directly with a tribal leader, a tribal chairman or a tribal president, tribal governor. Or you might be working with a tribal historic preservation officer or a tribal museum director. It varies, but it's important to find out, who those individuals are, what the government structure is like for the tribe. Again, because we are all very different, and just get a feel for what that tribal governance structure is like, and find out who to speak with within that system to understand how you then navigate and who you will be in, might need to be in contact with as you're uh, reaching out to them to present perhaps a project.
Interesting. No, that's very helpful. Yeah, I think there were several questions about that. Let's see here. There's a slew of questions coming in now, so I'm trying to sort through them a little bit. Can you? One person asked if you could speak to how concerned individuals can support the NAGPRA review and the development of more appropriate guidelines for their museums.
So this is the review process is a federal initiative, okay? And it evolved as a result of the this ongoing concern that's been conveyed by tribal leaders for many years now. At NAGPRA's, 30 years old at this point, and there are some significant issues that have been brought to the forefront for many years. And so it prompted this more thorough and comprehensive review of the entire policy. Last year, under this current administration, the review was organized, and there are different layers to this review. Again, this is that, as one of our former governors at Acoma likes to refer, the white tape. But there are all these processes. All these processes at the federal level that that become initiated, right, for a process of this type. Now there is, on occasion, there might be some opportunity for public comment, but it's very rare. Okay. I think the ways in which the public can support this is, and issues like, or not issues, but pending legislation like the STOP Act, is to contact your congressman and express your support of these pieces of legislation. The review or the revision of NAGPRA, the enactment of the STOP Act, the protection of sacred sites. That's one way that the public can be involved in this process, is to reach out to your federal representatives, congressional representatives, and ask them to support these initiatives.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. So then let's see here. How do I phrase this one? It's like I said, these questions are coming at me, so I'm trying to make them intelligible and follow a train here. So there was a question about for people who are very well intentioned, who are really interested in supporting this, who are just the general public. Is there organizations that they can reach out to help them understand what they're seeing? So when they go to Chaco Canyon, like the picture you have behind you, or Mesa Verde, or the Bears Ears, or other places, other native led or approved institutions that they should go to, and maybe what are some of those places, if you know any?
Well, there are a number of advocacy organizations in the country who are leading a lot of these initiatives. I'm the current chair of what's called the Chaco Heritage Tribal Association. This is one more recent initiative that was an effort of the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which is the 19 pueblos in New Mexico. And our task was to establish this association so that we might, for the first time in our history, develop on our own a comprehensive ethnographic study of the Greater Chaco region. And this study is so critical to the protection of Chaco Canyon and that Chaco landscape from further oil and gas development. So, this document, this study, will, once complete and in the hands of the Department of the Interior, will be the official record of the cultural resources on that landscape that must be protected, that cannot be compromised as a result of permitting for drilling and fracking that are issued by the Bureau of Land Management and other federal agencies. But in other parts of the country, there are also organizations. If you go to the Native American Rights Fund or the National Congress of the American Indian, and I believe even the National Museum of the American Indian websites, you will find some links to advocacy organizations who are both native and non-native led, who have joined this effort to protect sacred sites. Now, there isn't any, as far as I know, there really isn't an active organization that is leading the charge where this work in museums is concerned. However, I mentioned ATOM, the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. This is one organization where the public can also get involved as a member, but also to support the efforts of the ATOM, because they are addressing a very large agenda of issues that are of importance to Native American people, where, again, collections are concerned, but also the development of tribal libraries and tribal archives. Tribal libraries is one of those other really critical pieces, because during the pandemic, a lot of these tribal libraries became the hubs within our tribal communities for students and families to access the internet, one, for virtual instruction, but also, just became the central gathering places for community, and really, reminded us that, we need to be utilizing these resources, the library as a resource in the education of not only our students, but of ourselves. So yeah, I point folks in those directions, I guess at this point.
Oh, great, yeah, thanks. So another question that I know actually resonates with me also is, in particular, is so as an archaeologist, and for archaeologists listening in, if archaeologists want to do collections-based work in museums, how do they go about contacting tribes, or should they contact the museum if they want to look at particular items, and then the museum contacts the tribes, or should archaeologists contact the tribe before going to the museum, or like what is kind of the maybe best practice in terms of order of operations and some of those steps?
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question. What we like to see is that, if an independent archaeologist or scholar is interested in accessing collections for research and the associated documentation, museums have their own policies for that. Most do anyway. Now, if it involves seeking access to items that have been classified as culturally sensitive, then usually the museum will contact the tribe on behalf of the research requestor. And either if there's an agreement between the tribe and the institution for granting those types of permissions, then that plays out between the two entities. If some of those are not established, then usually the museum will have to, coordinate with the tribe to determine whether or not access can be granted. Now, sometimes, and in what I'm seeing more so than this time, is that where culturally sensitive materials are concerned, Museums will just say, no, we're sorry. We've, as a result of consultation with the particular tribes that are affiliated with these items, we cannot authorize access.
Let's see here. So let's see, we're just about out of the formal questions. But I guess along those, I guess to build on what the question I just asked, what if, in the course of doing that work, then the researcher determines that those things are very significant or thinks they might be, would then they go through the museum to say, hey, red flag, you need to talk to the tribes about this, or should they reach out independently to the tribes, or is that again going to be a case by case kind of depending on which museum you're working with or which institution?
I would say that's a case by case. There are some museums who have policies or procedures around that. There are situations when an institution will accept a private collection, and rather than reaching out to a tribe or tribes, they will contract a archaeologist or other science professional or appraisers, dealers, other collectors to help them understand what they have just taken into their collection. And sometimes as a result of that, some items would be red flagged as being culturally sensitive or perhaps protected under federal law. When that happens, then the responsibility lies in the museum to then make contact with the tribes. What would be better, and we see that this is something also evolving in some institutions, is that prior to accepting a collection, they will consult with tribes for guidance on whether or not these items should or are can or should be accepted. Sometimes an institution will put the collector in direct contact with a tribe. That doesn't happen often, but sometimes it does. And the result might be that there is a voluntary return, or the tribe provides the collector with a recommendation on the most appropriate or preferred institution to contact, who might be willing and in a position to accept the collection question.
Great. No, yeah, thanks. That's very helpful. And then, so I think probably just about out of time for questions, and we're just about out of questions. But well, there was a question about relating to what you were talking about, the published catalog from the Young University or the Young Museum, and particularly around the digitization or the use of not a photograph of that membranous pot. Are there any kind of general rules of thumb for guidelines in terms of publishing or displaying artifacts, things like that you think people should avoid? I mean, obviously, other than human remains, don't show those. But in terms of drawing a picture of a vessel, is it better to use that in a publication or a presentation than the actual picture of a vessel? Or any thoughts on that?
So again, as I stated earlier, this project really opened a new door for us. And it was really collaboration of the Pueblo experts that caused this alternative to emerge. And it actually took us some time to arrive at that decision, but we also felt comfortable. And like I said, we also made it very clear that there were some items that were so sensitive that they will call for a blank space. And those pieces would not be accessible. So, look out for the catalog. I think it comes out, if I'm not mistaken, the end of this year. And it's going to be really, I mean, it's a beautiful publication, but it's very interesting and very telling of a process that was instituted that informed the design and of this catalog, but also the presentation of the collection.
Great. Well, we look forward to seeing that. That sounds really exciting. Well, yeah, well, like I said, we're out of questions, but thank you so much, Brian, for this really just very informative and just really telling presentation. You know, really, I know it's struck at the hearts of many of our viewers. We had just at least dozens, let's say, of compliments in the chat. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for the really important work you're doing, both for Native American people and for the general public. And we really appreciate that, and we hope that you can come back again and speak with us in the future.
Thank you.
Have a good night.